Welcome to the Unity Forum, a cross-partisan program dedicated to fostering reasoned discourse and a more open society. In each episode, we talk with well-established experts to provide insight on recent events, elevate civil dialogue, and encourage greater mutual understanding on social, economic, and legal issues. Our host is Chris Malone, founder of Fidelum Group and author of the award-winning book, The Human Brand: How We Relate to People, Products, and Companies.
Welcome, and hello, I'm Chris Malone, and I'll be your host for today's discussion. Thank you for joining us. Our guest today is Dr. Ronnie Janoff-Bulman, Professor Emerita in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She's a renowned expert in both social and moral psychology. Her career is framed by two thought-provoking books. The first, published in 1992, Shattered Assumptions Towards a New Psychology of Trauma, established the seminal theory explaining the psychological impact of victimization. Her most recent book, published in 2023, The Two Moralities, Conservatives, Liberals, and the Roots of Our Political Divide, details a new framework based on fundamental human approach and avoidance motivations to explain why the moral aspects of liberalism and conservatism often seem so profoundly at odds. She earned her PhD from Northwestern University and is a highly decorated scholar, having received major recognition for her contributions, including the Morton Deutsch Award from the International Society for Justice Research. Welcome to the Unity Forum, Ronnie.
Thank you, Chris. Good to be here.
So I really enjoyed reading your book, and in the opening words of The Two Moralities, you shared an interesting kind of historical anecdote that I had not heard before about the origin of the terms left ring and right ring. And I was wondering if you could please recap that for listeners. I think they might find it interesting.
Sure. And I want to thank all the listeners that are joining us today as well. So in the summer of 1789, during the very early days of the French Revolution, the National Assembly, the new National Assembly, met to decide on the powers of the king. Now, a particularly contentious issue of the time was, should the king have veto power over the National Assembly or not? And it turns out that the way people sat made a difference, because the people who supported the royalist position, wanting to give the king the veto power, sat on the right, to the right of the National Assembly president. Those who did not want to give the king veto power sat to the left. And the French newspapers at the time essentially used this seating division to describe the political differences between these groups, with one supporting tradition and the status quo, that is the right, and the left supporting change and reform. This physical representation has actually been used as a metaphor for our political distinctions and differences since that time, several hundred years now, right? More than 200 years. And I do want to just add one other thing, taking advantage of my old elderly status here, just to point out that I am old enough to remember when there were conservatives who were moderate and liberal, like Nelson Rockefeller, Jacob Javits, and there were liberals who were quite conservative, George Wallace, Strom Thurmond. So there happened to have been diversity within party, ideological diversity within party. Today, I mean, this our seemingly unbridgeable chasm, more than the National Assembly aisle, is in part due, I think, to the fact that there's this monotonic alignment of party and political ideology, which has not certainly always been the case here.
Right. Well, in your book, you talk about and share a framework of both proscriptive and prescriptive morality, which kind of forms the basis of these two moralities in the book title. I was wondering if you could kind of explain for listeners what that, how this left wing and right wing stuff, has now been manifested in these two different types of moralities and how it all connects together. It's very interesting.
Okay. So I began with the most fundamental distinction in psychology and motivation, actually, approach-avoidance. All of us know that much of our behavior is based in wanting to approach the good and avoid the bad. Very, very simple distinction. Now, I applied this distinction to morality. Now, I came up with a 3x2 model that has to do with what the target is, whether we're thinking about ourselves, whether we're thinking about specific other people, which I think about the interpersonal domain, or society, the group. But in all cases, what I want to say is that there are two different forms of morality that map onto approach and avoidance. And quite simply, they look like harm, don't harm. If we think about the major proscriptions and prescriptions of morality, don't harm others, don't lie, steal, over benefit yourself. So don't harm, and help others. So you think about harming and helping as sort of the primary mode or modes of thinking about morality. Now, prescription is about what we should do. We should be helping others, right? What we want to move forward, provide for the well-being of other people. Proscriptive morality is based on the not harming, okay? Don't harm, don't steal, et cetera, et cetera. And in that simple interpersonal domain, when we're dealing with other people, there really aren't differences between liberals and conservatives. You know, liberals and conservatives all believe in helping and not harming, sort of the basic, the rudiments of group living, essentially. And by the way, I want to make a case. I think there are people out there probably saying, well, they're the same, right? Aren't they? Just with a simple example of, think of a toddler, okay, who with his or her toys. Toddlers who don't want to take others' toys, not harming another, engage in prescriptive morality. That's not the same as sharing their toys with others, okay? Those are very different behaviors, right? So what I'm most interested, or became most interested in, is the group domain for proscriptive and prescriptive morality and what those look like. And in the group context, the societal context, which really is the domain of politics, liberalism, that helping or providing morality, looks like a social justice morality. I've called it social justice morality, providing for the well-being of others in society. Proscriptive morality is about protecting. Social order morality is what I've labeled it. Social order is protecting the group from threats, whether internal or external, and the desire to maintain stability. So the fundamental motives of providing and protecting, I think, are still basic to this group domain, but they manifest in very different ways, because now we're talking about a social morality, social order morality, which has an emphasis on tradition, strong leaders, preference for power and authority, strict group norms. So, and often a social hierarchy, defined social roles. All of these are in the interest of stability and maintenance of a threat-free society, quote, protection. Social justice is about a caring community, providing for others, approaching the good here, improving welfare, and with an emphasis on equality, which means liberals are often emphasizing helping those worse off in a society, okay? Now, what's interesting to me about this is these two social justice, social order moralities not only reflect distinct moralities, okay, both of which, you know, are legitimate good moralities. We want to live in groups where we're protected and are provided for. But there ends up being a focus on very, very different kinds of government interventions. So for liberals, it's really about resource distribution primarily. That's the economic domain, providing funds or developing programs to focus on, you know, health, education, safety nets, etc. So there really is a government intervention is desired in this sort of economic domain, whereas in traditional conservatism, what we have is a focus on the social domain, on social roles, traditional roles, strict norms that are regarded as a bulwark against personal gratification that could sort of interfere with stability. We often think of conservatives wanting limited government, but of course, both the left and the right want limited government. The left wants it in precisely the domain of that conservatives want government intervention, right? Stay out of my body, stay out of my bedroom, sort of, autonomy for social roles and personal behaviors. Whereas conservatives now want autonomy and freedom primarily in the economic domain, which is where liberals want intervention, right? The economic domain where conservatives would prefer more or less unfettered free market. So let me stop there. I think that's just a mouthful, but.
And would it be correct to conclude from your work that kind of the optimal situation requires kind of a balance of both the prescriptive and proscriptive? Laudable things about both of those, and perhaps is the issue the balance versus the focus on one end or the other?
Yeah, and for transparency purposes, I should put out there that I'm very clearly in the liberal camp, okay? But I do really think that at a very basic level, I think what you're saying is true, that there needs to be some kind of balance. I even think, if you think about a group, you can go back to the smallest group, the family, or huge groups, large groups like society, where you need protection and provision of sort of care and goods. So I do think, at a very basic level, societies need both. That doesn't mean that the specific policies that are supported are the ones that we need. But again, the family. Back in the 1960s, Diana Baumrind, who was a developmental psychologist, did a great deal of work and came up with two dimensions for the family. One was demandingness, based on controlling the child, setting boundaries, and the other labeled responsiveness, which had to do with being attuned to children and responding to them. And she found, and I should say decades of research since then have also found, that the combination was best. That if you overemphasized the demandingness, you got authoritarianism, and children did not do very well at all. And if you overemphasized responsiveness, you got permissive parenting, and also the children didn't do as well. So there was some combination that actually was better. So I do actually think that too much of one or the other, as much as I'd love all the policies on the left to be the ones we live by, if we had no counterweight, probably we would all go too far, whether we're on the left or on the right, right? So on the right, we're going towards it now, authoritarianism. On the left, there might be much more social fragmentation because there is a kind of emphasis on competing identities to get resources. So yes, I will stand in that probably unpopular place and say probably I do believe we need both. I do believe we know, and in the best of worlds, there could be respect for each other, and we could work balancing things out and have true debates, right? Mm-hmm. Regarding the policies, and noting that we need both.
Right. Now, another thing in your book, you cited some very interesting research studies that seem to suggest that humans kind of psychologically, at least in kind of the personal domain, stuff that we do ourselves, have a little bit more of a tendency towards proscriptive moral choices versus prescriptive ones. And you gave some examples, if we have to throw a switch and decide whether the toddler gets hit by the train or the family gets hit by the train, we don't want to take any action. Whereas we all agree that we should give to charities and help the less fortunate and so forth, but not everybody finds their way to do that. I was wondering if you could explain that a little bit further as well.
Yeah. The proscriptive is very specific. I mean, we find out if you think about, you go to religion and the 10 Commandments, 8 of the 10 are what you should not do. And they're very specific. Don't lie, don't steal, don't do this, don't do that. And it's very specific because erring on those is kind of really problematic for a society. Prescriptive, I think it's honor your mother. I should know that. I don't really know. Honor your mother, your parents. Keep the Sabbath. Those are also very real. But how do you honor your parents? People know how not to cheat, right? How do you honor your parents? How do you keeping the Sabbath? You then have to find out what are all the rituals, right? It's kind of interesting. Very early on, you find that it's easier to learn the proscriptive than the prescriptive. That is, so some research by a woman named Chris Malone has done a lot of work with young children, where she does the do's and the don'ts. Well, even think back to the toddlers we were talking about earlier who don't don't share their toys, right? They still may not take others' toys, right? So prescriptive is easier. But she does a lot of that in the laboratory, and finds that it's, for young children, very young children whose behavioral repertoires are not already established, it's easier to learn proscriptive. Often that's because it's more specific,
Right.
but it's also, there may be, we have a negativity bias, psychologically, okay? We focus, anyway, what I should say is when we become adults, though much of our behavioral repertoire is already established, but we still know we're not supposed to cheat or lie or steal or kill people. That is always wrong. Peter Singer and Unger and great moral philosophers who are dealing with what is prescriptive, they don't talk about it this way, but what would be prescriptive immorality, raise the same question you do, as would I. How far does prescriptive morality go? So they bring up the case of the trolley problem with the Bugatti, a very fancy car that I had never heard of, by the way, on one trolley track and a child on the other. And should you, in fact, if the trolley is moving down the track, should you flick the switch so the trolley goes to the Bugatti and destroys the car as opposed to kills the child? And all of us would certainly agree that it would be horrendously immoral not to do that. But as they point out, and I want to point out, is we are all living that life because, or not all of us, but those of us who are comfortable enough to eat, have a home, be comfortable. If you have extra money, you should have an obligation, they believe, to support those who are living in poverty, right? Now, is that an obligation? So that's this whole question of where do prescriptive morals, where's the bar for you, right? But that's right. But I think it's an interesting question. These differ. The two moralities differ along a number of dimensions. Yeah.
And I think it's also notable, you mentioned this in passing, but that, it seems that most of the major religions, whether it's Christianity, Judaism, Islam, even Buddhism, all advocate for both prescriptive and proscriptive moral teachings, essentially. And is that, in human societies and civilizations, is that kind of fundamental? And is that kind of where some of our political leanings come from?
Well, I think we'd have these differences whether we had political differences, whether we had religion or not. But I do think that the proscriptive look, I should start out with, I'm a social psychologist. I believe very strongly in the notion that we are social animals. Despite all the emphasis on individualism today, we are fundamentally social. We live in groups. There are advantages to living in groups. And the only way to survive and thrive as groups or in groups is by developing some moral system. Now, it can be crude, but every group knows you shouldn't harm others. This is by virtue of living together. We learn you can't harm others and you need to help others in need, right? So I think that is fundamental to being a social animal. And by the way, primatologists believe that it exists in primate cultures, primate groups. Now, religion, though, I think you're quite right in the sense that religions I think they're cultural creations that do reinforce morality, right? They're moral authority. It's a moral authority for many, many people. But it is not the case that people who are not religious aren't moral. There's actually, there are some very interesting studies people might want to know about, which is, it is true that people who are religious are more giving and benevolent towards their own group, but they are more prejudiced and less giving and less benevolent to those who are not in the religious group, which, by the way, echoes our political divisions. So religion ends up being a social identity or a tribal identity like others, right? But that's not to say also, Chris, that as we've seen in the United States, that religions, and there are liberal and conservative denominations, right, that religions have frequently joined with political groups to increase the clout of one or the other or both. And certainly the religious right now is a very powerful element of conservatism.
Right. So given all this, our aim with the Unity Forum series is to help bridge divides between us. And so given what you have learned and based on your model, what would you think that liberals ought to know about the moral psychology of conservatives? And then vice versa, what do you think it'd be important for conservatives to understand about the morality of liberals, find more common ground and understanding between us?
We need to know that both are grounded in morality. I think too often what happens is we see that we have different policy preferences, right? And that leads us to often demonize each other. But if we could begin to understand that these policy preferences derive from sort of very different moral motives, but both are moral, right? I think we could stop the attributional demonization that automatically, I think, happens when we see people on the other side of the political spectrum. We say they disagree with us. There's this, the demonization is remarkable on both sides, by the way. I wish I could say it's more on one than the other, but research doesn't seem to suggest that. The demonization is real. We immediately start to distrust. We question motives. We think people are ill-intentioned. Because they are on the other side of the political spectrum. And again, because of this monotonic alignment of conservatism and party, the party view will belong to now is kind of really a tribal identity. And if you are in the other tribe, people begin to demonize you. Now, I do think when I talk about conservatism, I do sort of have much more hope for sort of traditional liberalism, conservatism coming together around this notion that we are truly concerned about the welfare of the country. And I don't, the big question is, how do you get people to believe that we all we're moral people? One way, of course, is the old social psychology contact. We need to be in touch with each other. And increasingly, we don't even talk to each other. We don't even live near each other. It used to be the old contact hypothesis in psychology where the left, you put two groups together, particularly face-to-face. Face-to-face interaction is very important. You begin to understand that, yes, you both care about your kids or your grandparents, or you both care about schools and education. You understand the other's humanity. So there's a lot more sort of generosity in interpreting what the other person's doing. I do think the big shift in this country now, even geographically, where we live, means you often don't even meet people on the other side. So my mantra would be try to talk to others, right? But this is a big ask, a very big ask, Chris.
Yeah. Well, so, what you mentioned about how we often don't meet each other and it's very easy to demonize one another and so forth, that makes me, of course, think of what are the role of broadcast and social media and kind of amplifying those kind of misreading or, misjudgment to the moral motives of either side or what have you. Any thoughts on how we could kind of start to bridge the divide there? Is it, as you say, get off the social media and start to talk to people in person, or are there other approaches that might work as well?
Well, if we could develop an independent journalism, I mean, it's getting worse and worse, and I don't have to tell people listening, we are now dealing with the angriest voices, the most distractions, the angriest, nastiest voices get, they get the attention, right? We know politicians even, we have evidence that Republican politicians are far more conservative than Republican voters in general, right? And on social media, what we're finding, both on the left and right, I think we're in trouble. Again, my age, I remember Walter Cronkite. Probably many people probably never even heard of him, but Walter Cronkite was on the evening news. Everybody watched the evening news. There were 3 stations. Most people watched Walter Cronkite. I could not have told you what his politics were. I have no idea where his left, right, middle, anything. People watched him. He presented the facts. We don't even know, nobody even knows what the facts are. We've always believed that, putting things out in the public sphere is the healthiest way to get through things, because we will debate them, et cetera, et cetera. We don't have a public sphere now in which that happens. And that's frightening to me. That really is frightening. So first we have to get facts. We have to have a public sphere. Where is that? The development of independent journalism would be very helpful, right? Very, very helpful. And I think everybody's probably getting them sent. You have the ink, you have Public Citizen. You're hearing lots of TPM. But more than 60% of the people get their news from social media. Would regulating that help? I don't know. We could also go for the social psychological belief that, there has to be a major challenge where the antagonists have to work together, right? What is this? Is this some Martian invasion, some AI taking over humanity, some catastrophic thing that could happen? Yes, that might help. I'd hate that to be the way we get together, right? They also seem so sci-fi and unreal. Maybe one party will become so extreme that the authoritarianism will be so frightening even to people in that party that the left and the right can start working together. We can't go anywhere unless we work together. So I'm hoping that sort of we can.
One of the things I've had on my mind is this notion of, getting people together and having conversations. And we are approaching the holiday season where many of us will get together with members of our family that might have differing views and so forth. What advice would you offer to us as we think about having those conversations and how we might apply these insights to conversations we might have with family members? Maybe that is a place that those conversations to better understand one another could start. What do you think?
What I would say is the best thing probably is not necessarily talking about politics, talking about what brings you together as a family. I think, because if you're with people with different political views, you could talk about the possibility that, yes, we are both coming from a moral place, but you're coming from a place that, wants to protect the society, and that leads to certain things. I come from a place that really wants to provide. We need to do both. You could possibly bring that up and have a conversation about protecting and providing and how we need both. And unfortunately, we have different policy preferences, but maybe we shouldn't have so much disagreement just based on those. We're going to have disagreements, but not have those at your dinner table, but talk about the underlying motives. I would just say, try to have attributional generosity with your family, okay? I know that's very difficult when you're sitting with someone that you totally disagree with, but that person also would probably be a person who would do a lot of good things for you if you were in need, right? And remembering that our humanity is probably more important, right?
Right. So that assuming positive intent, and that from a morality standpoint, underlying these two philosophies are positive intent, just differing approaches to positive intent.
Absolutely.
So let's take a few questions from those listening remotely today. The first question is from Paras Bhargava. Is there a rural-urban divide between proscriptive and prescriptive? Do rural folks want to go back in time when things were better, and urban folks want to further change along the path that we have been changing? Is there kind of a geographic aspect to things?
Yes, there is actually a strong geographic aspect to, obviously there are people on the left and right within both, but we know the collective soup of ideological diversity of color and race, color, religion, ethnicity, whatever, LGBTQ preferences. In cities, people meet others. We were talking earlier about contact. We meet lots of others. That matters. It makes a huge difference. Traditionally, the left has always been, liberalism has always been present in the cities where trade routes were the hubs of trade routes, where people met others that weren't like them. In the rural areas, people tend to see others most like themselves, okay? So it not only, it almost reinforces a conservative view. One thing we should think about, another difference between prescriptive and proscriptive, and again, there are many, liberalism and conservatism here, let's think, is how broadly how wide is your moral circle, your circle of moral concern? And it turns out that liberals have a much wider circle of moral concerns and include people that are not like them. They're not like them in terms of identity as much as conservatives, whose moral circle, again, will do as much with family and friends, but the moral circle does not extend as broadly. Part of this you can understand in terms of if your idea is your conservatism or your morality is based on defending against threats. If you have attuned to threats, if you're attuned to threats, basically you will be most comfortable with people just like you, right? You will be, which basically helps account for this sort of limited moral concern. You want to be with people like yourself. You trust those people most like you. They're in your tribe, right? Rural areas, unfortunately, by being much less heterogeneous, really reinforce this notion of, they begin to be more similar. That's who you learn to trust. You're not seeing as many different people. There's not as much contact with others. So they tend to be based in a conservative protect notion much more than in cities where you see other people. So you can look at any election, look at a presidential election. You can go to Texas, and the rural areas are all conservative, and the big cities are liberal. Which is why when we talk about red and blue states, it's a little bit problematic because big cities in red states tend to be blue. Right. But there is this divergence that's very real.
Very interesting. Thank you. We also have another question from Sharon McCarthy. What's of more value, highlighting what's different between the two groups or what's the same?
Well, the question, I suppose that really does depend on your goals, but it would be great to be able to highlight what's the same, which is that we are talking about moral people. Okay, yeah. That's where the intent. We are not ill-intentioned. We the generosity, the attributional generosity, I think, is really, really pretty important. The differences are so apparent to people in terms of the policy preferences that if we could start thinking about the common humanity and the common morality, I think it would be helpful.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned two words there that struck me as something I like to talk about in a business context, and that's this notion of worthy intent. And that we often share the idea that the way to form a relationship with another person is to demonstrate that your intentions are worthy of their trust and loyalty, or what we call the principle of worthy intent. Right. And so I think that could perhaps have application in this context as well.
That's right. Yeah. Yes.
Here's a question from Roger Booth. Based on the continuum that you've described, where would you place libertarians and what underlies that worldview?
That's a great question, and thank you. Liberalism and conservatism are the largest, and liberals are high on social justice, lower on social order. Conservatives are higher on social order and lower on social justice. Libertarians actually tend to be low on both, right? So when we were talking earlier, I was saying earlier that liberals and conservatives differ on the government interventions they prefer, right? Both have a preference, either based in protection or providing. They want government intervention. Libertarians are low on both. Libertarians are the group that have no group morality. Now, that doesn't mean they're not moral. They're very moral, okay? But their morality is based on interpersonal morality. Does it harm someone directly, or does it help them directly? It's not, the intervention of government should be kept to a minimum. So what's interesting about libertarians is they could vote as Democrats or Republicans. Typically, libertarians they're very much about an unfettered market. The economic domain matters a lot. And so most decide, or have over time, voted with Republicans, okay, with conservatives. But there are libertarians who care much more about maintaining autonomy and control in the bedroom, or in terms of people's own lives, in terms of LGBTQ issues or abortion. They would be voting with Democrats. There's also a group called communitarians. That is a very small group in our society, but those tend to be people who are very high on both social order and social justice. It's not as if it's impossible, right? They believe in restrictions on, abortion, gay rights, gay marriage, etc., stem cell research, you name it. But they also believe strongly in benefiting those worse off in society, want strong social nets. There are several religious groups that particularly we might define as communitarian. So thank you.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Here's an anonymous question. How should we define protecting society? Some people would say eliminating immigrants or people of color is protecting society, whereas many of us would take great issue with that. How would you interpret that?
Yeah, but I mean, that I think is a very good question that, I think about protecting society from real threats. Now, what's interesting is for conservatives, they do think not allowing immigrants in is about protecting society, which is why it's so big. It's so largely painted on their palette, on their political easel. Protecting in general would mean protecting against actual threats to the security and well-being of a society. For liberals, of course, look at immigration very differently. Liberals look at it as providing for people who need something. Immigrants come here because you don't leave a country easily, right? It's very hard to leave a country. They're coming for better times, trying to support a family, trying to help their children, there are many issues where people see them through these two different lenses. Now, I do still think protecting means trying to preserve what you have from something getting worse. And providing means trying to move forward to help someone improve their lives. I think that would, so yes, you're exactly right in asking, you didn't ask this, but I'm reinterpreting, so forgive me, can the same issue be perceived quite differently according to these two moralities? Yes, and I think that's very interesting. And it's why we have these these disagreements. Proscriptive and prescriptive perspectives take this issue and rip it apart at its seams, right? It's very problematic.
Got it. So we have a few more questions than we'll probably get to. So I'm going to have to, unfortunately, just pick one before we start to move to close. This from Allison Gunn. If bridging isn't possible with a group, specifically if the other group is actively opposed to the existence of people with a certain identity, whether it's race, sexuality, religion, etc., what are our responsibilities when interacting with them? I have thoughts on that, but I'd be interested in yours as well.
We are supposed to be living together in the same groups. I think we have an obligation to try to change people. I do. How we do that is very, very problematic. Again, I think figuring out how you talk to people around common human issues. Look, they're all things we care about. Trying to show that we are all, and that we're all in this game together called life, right? I mean, we're in this together. I find it very hard to deal with people who are not willing to accept the existence of others. On the other hand, we get nowhere if we're still in this society together. We get nowhere if we give up. So I don't know. I'm not. I feel like I'm not a minister or a rabbi. I think they would have better recommendations about this. But I think social psychology would say contact is still the best thing we could do. I don't know, Chris, do you have thoughts about that?
I do. So, I think we are all at risk at times to dehumanize others or see others of a social group that we are unfamiliar with or disagree with or what have you as somehow less than human. And when we start to allow ourselves to see others as less than human, only bad stuff happens. And so even if there are those who might say or, at the moment believe that some other group shouldn't exist, I believe that with greater contact, like you have mentioned, greater conversation, and often with stories that help people see the good in others, we can actually come to better understand one another and be more resistant to this idea of allowing ourselves to see others as less than human.
Right.
Thank you so much, Ronnie. This has really been an insightful and thought-provoking conversation, as I knew it would be. Thank you to our listeners today as well for your time and your thoughtful questions. And be sure to join us for our next episode of the Uniforum. It's sure to be another enlightening and inspiring discussion. Until then, have a great rest of your day. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks for listening today. If you enjoyed this episode of the Unity Forum, please give it a rating, share it with others, and join us on Facebook at Alumni for Freedom and Democracy. And be sure to join us next time for another thought-provoking discussion on the big ideas shaping our collective future.